Hello there, I'm Stuart Garlick and welcome to the E-Talking podcast from Motion E, the place for discussion on Formula E, electric vehicles and sustainable transport. We're in between Formula E races at the moment, having left Santiago, Chile, with the drivers and teams currently preparing for a post-Valentine's Day date in Mexico City on February the 15th. With me in this show is Conrad O'Keefe, journalist for eRacing.net, as we decide which drivers swept us off our feet and which have some explaining to do after the Santiago E-Prix. If you want to find free content from Motion E, then head on over to motione.org. If you'd like to find exclusive content with a chance to influence what we talk about in future podcasts and also in articles, then bop on over to patreon.com and search for Motion E. So, pretty exciting race in Santiago, Chile, wasn't it? I think we both probably are united on what the main story was. Can we both agree that Max Günther and his first win was the main story?
We certainly can. Youngest race winner in Formula E history. I think there's a few things. One, Maxi obviously being so young, and I think it's from Maxi's background, rather than him being, say, someone that we've seen before in Formula One or touring cars or IndyCar. He's someone that we've seen only in junior series like Formula 2 and Formula 3. So to say that he's had a different career path would be very apt. And yeah, I think that's what's making it a lot more exciting. Is this is the first time we've seen him in a true like top level series where it's not so much about development as showing what you've got and trying to win. And so soon into his career, because his first year was with Dragon and he didn't have the machinery to be able to do this. In only his second race in a car that is capable of doing this, he's won. And he's proven to an experienced competitor in Alexander Sims that he's not going to have it all his own way and that there's going to be a stern challenge.
It is quite extraordinary. And I feel also there's a kind of comparison to be made between him and one of those bands that seems to just burst onto the scene. Maybe, you know, used to be the NME, would now appear on the music websites, and then they'd just be there. A bit like the Strokes, maybe in 2001. In that, yes, Max Günther has been around in Junior Formula. People who watch Formula 2 will know him from that, and he did get a race win there as well. But to the racing public at large, he was pretty much unknown until season 5, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. Anyone who watched the junior series knew who he was, but outside of there, no, he wasn't particularly well known. So he really has burst onto the scene. He got a lot of plaudits in season 5 when he was with Dragon and putting some inspired performances, and there was a lot of debate about the way he was dropped by Dragon for a few races in exchange for Felipe Nasr and then brought back into the side. It was a tricky season for him, but any experience he's taken from that season has obviously paid dividends when it comes to season 6, because he's got an electric start, winning only his second race for BMW Andretti in a car that looks like he's a real challenger for the title, in a way that the Cheetahs have been, Audis have been in the past. Pretty ominous performance, and he's showing he can unlock that.
He definitely is. Were you surprised by how much better his performance was than Alexander Sims, given how the tables turned quite significantly from Diriyah, where Sims was definitely the team leader?
If it was almost any other series, then I would be, but in Formula E, dynamics between teammates or title rivals or anyone in general switches so quickly from race to race that it's kind of become, like expected. You're a lot more numb to it. It could quite easily change the next race, that maybe Günther has teething problems that Sims doesn't. Experience might become more of a power play in the next race, but I think it'll be one of those dynamics between the two where they ebb and flow. They're comfortable with each other and can push the team forward. Because now that BMW has season 5 out of the way, where they started so strongly and fell back, and you could argue some naivety was in play because they weren't particularly used to challenging for titles. Now they've got that experience of doing that. Season 6 can be a lot smoother for them. And Gunther's showing that he's no weak link in his lack of experience, that it's not negatively affecting him as such. I think it'll be one of those dynamics that ebbs and flows. The one that I think of is in Formula One when we had Felipe Massa and Kimi Raikkonen at Ferrari.
Mm.
They were two top standout drivers in a team where the only times they've really had two standout top drivers has been when they've tripped over each other, or there's been suggestions that there's an uneasy dynamic, but BMW are making this work because they've chosen right, and the two of them definitely get along. And I feel like when one is on the top of the game, it'll coincide with another one being on the top of their game a race or two down the line, and it'll kind of ebb and flow like that.
And Alexander Sims does seem to have taken that new wave of confidence from his pole position in New York, and that seems to be something that's still enduring. I don't think he will he will take any negativity away from Santiago. The reason he dropped out of the race was because he was involved in one of those many midfield melees that we've come to expect in Formula E, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was an unfortunate DNF. He didn't seem like he had the pace of Maxi, but it wasn't a bad performance. I mean, you can't really call it a bad performance when it lasts all of 1 or 2 laps. But it was one of those races where Alex will try and learn from it. He was in a jovial mood, as much as he could be anyway, after the race, because it was seen that he was trying to get closer to Maxi and the team to celebrate. But I think it was that he was stuck behind a fence, so he just celebrated with the fans. Instead, he was stood there watching with the fans, which I thought was quite a nice, touching moment.
Well, talking about being stuck celebrating behind a fence, I saw someone who I thought looked exactly like you celebrating at the podium ceremony among the fans in Santiago. So I think you've got a doppelganger in Chile.
A doppelganger that's travelling to the Formula E races for me.
Well,
living my dreams.
It's possible they've just cloned you, so there's someone else doing race reports in Spanish.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. That's an interesting one to think of.
Yeah. All right, so I wrote, and you wrote a very similar thing about this being the start of something very, very big in terms of Formula E and Maximilian Günther. We could be looking at a driver for the 2020s. Now, Formula E does not give itself over to dominance at all. The qualifying system, the fact that the cars are pretty even, and the fact that there are so many outstanding drivers there makes it almost impossible for one driver to dominate a sport for an era. But are we possibly looking at Formula E's Michael Schumacher or Charles Leclerc, someone who's going to stand out amongst all the others for a few years here?
That's a hard one to call, but he's in pole position for being that driver right now. He's the first of a new wave of drivers who have entered Formula E in a younger state than the drivers that have gone before. Drivers that started off with the series were around 5 years older, say, than what Maxi is now, or pushing on 7 or 8. So they've got a shorter career span within Formula E ahead of them. Some drivers are already getting into their early to mid-30s, so eventually they're going to have to bow out soon, or at least you'd think. Whereas with Maxi, let's say he's got a longer shelf life for his career. If he decides to stay in Formula E and stick it out for all those years, there's potential for it. There's also potential for Nick de Vries to challenge him, because he's within that new wave as well. Yeah, you could take them two and consider them the Leclerc and Verstappen of Formula E in a way.
If I were to pick out two very young drivers who might come through and be the next Buemi and Degrassi for the Gen 2, Gen 3 era, I think it would be Günther and De Vries, just because they've both come into the sport almost looking fully formed. I know Günther had his fair share of skirmishes last season and involvement in, incidents, but so did everybody else. It now seems like now he's got a car capable of starting on the front row. He's capable of using the resources he's got available to him. De Vries, on the other hand, has come in what's pretty much a top car. And I wonder how surprised you are at the pace of Mercedes that we've seen over 3 races.
I knew that Mercedes would be quick this season in a way that was a different scenario to, say, Porsche, where they've obviously had to build a team from the ground up for the season because they had season 5 learning and progressing with HWA. Stoffel put in some very solid performances in that HWA. It wasn't one of the quickest cars by any means, but it wasn't a slowpoke either. There was potential to build on. And with a partnership like Van Dorn and De Vries, that's not taking away from the job Gary Paffett did, but I do feel like it's a stronger lineup this time round. And with Paffett as a test driver, with his experience, I feel that's the best compromise that Mercedes reached. The driver lineup's solid. Cars made the natural progression in performance that you'd expect with Mercedes hopping in full time now. I'm not particularly surprised, and I think that Stoffel's consistency in particular has boosted Mercedes up the beanstalk into the higher regions. It's a matter of consistency because we've not had much of that over the first 2 races. There's other cars that you could potentially say are faster that haven't been maximised. I mean, now that I look at the standings, it just shows what a brilliant job BMW and Mercedes are doing, and it kind of feels like called DTM because BMW lead the way on 60 points, and the only team at the moment that's holding a candle to them is Mercedes, who are on 56 points. The next one is Virgin Racing, who had a dismal weekend in Santiago, are on 38 points. So away from BMW, that's more than a third of the points total in the way.
Van Dorn is 28 in March. He's one of those peculiar characters who always seems like a young driver, even though he's actually not. But perhaps he's the Paul Rudd of motorsport in that way. But I think probably Mercedes are breathing a sigh of relief that their powertrain is good enough to obviously put him in that championship lead right now. But it's also the consistency. It's the fact that, okay, Nick De Vries got the time penalty for a technical infringement. Both of them finished the race, and it doesn't look like they have any problems running, without issue. There aren't any technical faults there. Would you attribute that to Mercedes using their F1 experience, where, well, they hardly ever blow up in F1 either, do they?
Mercedes have got a lot of racing experience in a lot of different categories, and we know some of the team personnel has been moved from other racing efforts. Yeah, moving personnel that are already experienced to Formula E that have been within Mercedes projects, I think helps a lot. And also their F1 experience of being able to build a very dominant powertrain, very reliable as well, has definitely come in handy. They're a very, very talented squad at Mercedes. And I just feel like there's a lot of consistency within that team. It's very settled. It's very easygoing. The drivers know what they have to do. The team know what they have to do. Their strategy is usually on point. Their energy management is fine. There isn't a particular weak spot.
There were a couple of incidents during the race, though, between teammates. Now, the first one between teammates was actually one that we had a grandstand seat for because Felipe Massa had the driver's eye camera, which is a new innovation for Formula E for this most recent race. Driver's eye essentially shows, it's a tiny GoPro underneath the visor, so you see exactly what the driver sees. And we saw a particularly panicked moment where Massa was shoved into the wall, much like last season, only last season it was by Ollie Rowland, and this time it was by his teammate Edo Mortara. Was that a bit of afters, or do you think that was something completely unavoidable from Mortara?
It was a tight situation, and looking back at the replays, because I did look back at a replay of it, it wasn't particularly shoved Massa. He was kind of like more guided towards the wall and managed to back out of it. And as far as I saw post race, there wasn't really that many complaints from either side about the move. It's an interesting thing to see, like during the E-Prix, to have that kind of camera angle on a car. Well, not on the car, but on the driver themselves. To have the driver's eye view, because developing the way that people can interact with the sport and the way they can get closer to the drivers, and not only the pressure that they're under, but the sensory experience that they have when they're behind the wheel is very important, and it's incredibly engaging. There's a bright future in having those kinds of camera angles and that kind of technology to build on.
I would agree with you there, and I was going to talk later about television coverage, but I think we should talk about it now. Really, before I start talking about the Formula E television coverage and why it's of so much of a higher standard than so much of other motorsport, I think, Conrad, we'd both like to talk about Bob Varsha, wouldn't we? So, Bob Varsha, member of the Formula E broadcasting team since season 1, was announced recently that he has particularly aggressive form of pancreatic cancer, which he's currently receiving treatment for. The American motorsport journalist Marshall Pruitt set up a GoFundMe page, which is still open. I think it's very nearly achieved its target the last time I checked.
When I was first getting into Formula E, it was a trio of Dario Franchitti, Jack Nicholls. They were the main two that you mostly heard during the coverage. And then there was Bob Varsha, who was in a way like Formula E's Ted Kravitz. I don't necessarily want to say they were very similar, because they had like different things going on. Whereas with Ted, you got a lot of mechanical insight. You could also get that from Bob, but he added a lot of calmness and composure to the coverage, where Dario and Jack were very excitable and giddy. When you heard snippets from Bob, it mellowed the tempo and, added a different dynamic that I found really settling, and it just built up towards this trio of commentators that made it an absolute joy to listen to Formula E. I think it's the best trio that I've heard on any racing series. And I've listened to Formula One coverage on multiple different channels. I've listened to IndyCar coverage, listened to BTCC coverage, touring cars, Le Mans. None of them top that trio, and Bob was an essential part of that. And he's been a major loss for season 6. And it's just gutting to hear that he's obviously suffering with a very serious condition right now. And I was really glad to see that a lot of people are pulling together and supporting him, and also donating to a GoFundMe that will go towards him. And yeah, I just encourage like anyone to donate whatever they can. And yeah, he's an incredible person.
That brings us on to the question of the TV coverage, because ever since I started watching Formula E as a fan, what I noticed was, well, the accessibility, obviously, because at the time it was free to air on YouTube all around the world. I think season 1 and season 2 certainly were, but even now, they've still kept that sense of fun, which you could certainly argue Formula One doesn't have, but other categories don't seem to have. I know I keep jumping on a soapbox about DTM. I've mentioned it before on this podcast, and I don't like to knock other forms of motorsport, but DTM is a great series, and they have, well, some Formula E drivers there, like Robin Frijns, for example, and like Nico Muller now, but they don't seem to ever capitalise on the personalities they have there. So I've been watching DTM for a couple of seasons. I still don't know what kind of a person René Rast is. and they don't seem to bother with the fun VTs in the same way Formula E does. They don't seem to have the same kind of rapport between the crew on the grid and the crew in the commentary box, and it's almost like Formula E worked really hard on not just getting people to be really good at their jobs as commentators or presenters, but also getting people to really gel and be friendly with each other and get that rapport going, would you say?
Yeah, I feel like the coverage that we've had within Formula E has been very close knit. I just think like everyone feels very like well gelled together. Everyone has a role that they fulfill to the best, and like each role like leads into another. We'll have Vernon Kay, um, yeah, doing the build up and like interviewing drivers, and he contributes quite a lot. And I was very surprised when Vernon first became a part of Formula E, and I did have my doubts because I've seen it before when like people from drastically different career paths then become a part of sport. But just like with Steve Jones on Channel 4's F1 coverage, it's worked. He does very well. I think he's adapted very well to Formula E, and you could tell that he's got a real passion for it and also knows how to show it. And then, yeah, we've got plenty of other people that are able to add a lot to the race coverage. We've had Alan McNish in the past, who's been wonderful. And yeah, it just feels like it's a very close-knit group that know what to say and when. They know when to be jovial, when to be informative. And I think we're really, really blessed to have the coverage we have now.
There is a YouTube channel called Charisma on Command, which gives people certain strategies that they can use to feel more confident in the presence of other people, to be better at public speaking, to be, to allow their natural sense of humour to come out without being stupid, that kind of thing. I feel like Vernon Kay is Charisma on Command because he's able to keep that authority when he's on the grid and when he's in the pit lane. And he's able to keep that authority with the drivers who, will take the rip if they can see there's a weakness in the presenters. And yet still he seems like a sort of fun older brother. And I saw this with an interview he did with Pascal Wehrlein before the race. He sat down with him, and Pascal was under an umbrella with his headphones in, and first thing he said was, what's on your earpods? So what's on your AirPods rather? So instantly he put Pascal at ease by sort of, making him think that he wasn't like everybody else. And I think Pascal made one of his kind of semi-sarcastic comments about being a bit busy or preparing for the race, and you always come to me and interview me, and Vernon said something which I really liked. He flattered him basically, so he couldn't not give the interview. He said, "That's because you're the best at doing interviews, Pascal," and that just put him at ease straight away. So I think Vernon's really picked up that trick from television presenting and from doing, panel shows, from doing game shows, but yeah, you almost need that person anchoring the coverage, someone with that endless confidence who isn't going to get knocked back by drivers.
Yeah, that's a perfect way of describing it, actually, because that's what Vernon does. And like I made the reference to Steve Jones, that's what he does as well. He's able to put people at ease, especially the drivers. You just speaking to them not so much as that you're interviewing them, as that you're like a fan in a higher position that just wants to know what's going on and wants to provide that to other fans back home. I think it's a great dynamic that Vernon's able to find, and he does it incredibly well.
And everyone did a tremendous job, but when Nikki Shields was away having the baby last year, simply because they brought in presenters to interview who were new to Formula E. You instantly felt the difference, didn't you, in terms of the quality of the interviews, in terms of the drivers weren't as relaxed around the new presenters and they were trying to take them for a ride on occasions. And, you know, again, you know, Nikki is different to Vernon, but the way that she interviews the drivers, it's kind of, she's giving them space to answer the question, but she's making sure they answer the question, isn't she?
Yeah. Yeah, it's just goes to show that they're not replaceable cogs in a wheel, in that you barely notice what's going on there. Real people with real personalities, and you can tell when one of them's gone and another new person has arrived, because they all have their own redeeming qualities and style of reporting and interviewing. And yeah, I could tell the difference between Nikki not being there and someone else like Vernon being there instead. Not necessarily like any better or worse. They just provide something different, and they're very good at what they do.
Yeah. And I'm consistently surprised by how well Dario Franchitti calls the race as a guest pundit, given that he's never actually driven an electric racing car, because he seems to be able to apply his experience of other formulae. I mean, obviously Dario is a three-time Indy 500 winner. He's one of the best drivers Britain has produced, but he seems to be able to apply that to a sport that he's not driven in. Would you say that maybe the skills of driving a racing car incredibly fast are quite transferable?
Yeah, I think some of the experience of racing is very transferable from one series to the other. It's the driving a car aspect of what you'll know. I think it's just the Formula E specifics, like managing battery levels, or I don't know, racing on really tight street circuits. But he's got a bit of experience of that with IndyCar road courses as well. So Dario's not going into that quite cold turkey. I think it's just the Formula E specific stuff that impresses me the most with the way that Dario is able to call it. Obviously, he'll be speaking to other people who are experts in the field in Formula E. He'll be speaking to team bosses and team members who'll be able to tell him the ins and outs and give him the information. But to be able to apply that information as if it's his lived experience and provide back to the fans some incredibly insightful commentary about cars that he's not raced before is actually incredible, I think.
So, aside from the presenting team, who are obviously brilliant, and it's lightning in a bottle in many ways, because other forms of motorsport have tried and are trying to replicate that team, and, well, they can't do it because they're unique people. But aside from that, there's something about the way Formula E television coverage goes on the screen that just feels different to, for example, F1 coverage, and feels different to, well, DTM coverage and to any other formula. And people have criticised the IndyCar TV coverage, and I feel that sometimes when people criticise other forms of motorsports television coverage, what they're criticising is, you're not quite as good as Formula E, are you? But what is it, do you think, that's different about Formula E television coverage, apart from the team?
It's the balance, because when you look at, say, when Bob was around and Formula E coverage was at its peak, you had Jack Nicholls, who was fairly balanced. He knew when to turn on, like the sugar rush energy. And he was very good at doing that, and he was able to provide that spark. And then there was Dario, who was incredibly chilled out, but you could say the most stern of the three. Like Dario's the one that you go to when you want to hear that, say, a struggling driver has made a mistake. He's the one that you go to when you want it called as it is, like straight talking. And then with Bob, he, was a lot calmer, and he kind of gave like a, the uncle vibe, if you know what I mean. He calmed things down, and he slowed the tempo from being, like Jack's sugar rush energy, like bouncing off of Dario, trying to give the Brundle-esque technical insight. And Sky's F1 coverage, for example, I feel tries to go for a very similar kind of leveling out, because, I mean, big bundles of energy is what Crofty is all about, David Croft. And Martin Brundle, on the other hand, is very, like calm, collected, most of the time, at least. Whereas Ted, he's also quite, like energetic and raring to go. One thing I found with F1 coverage, it just feels more, like it's set to get your heart racing. Whereas with the Formula E coverage, it feels like they just let the racing do that to your heart, and then they just create balanced commentary that gives you the information when you need it and makes you feel quite comfortable with watching all of it and that you're not being overloaded, because that's something that can happen quite easily with Formula E when you consider all the action that goes on and how many chaotic races we've had. Almost every Formula E race has been very chaotic in some way. I feel like the commentary knows that, the commentary team, so they just try to balance it out to make sure that no one's overloaded, they're all enjoying the race, and that they're getting like each little sprinkle of emotion when they need it.
I feel like the graphics on the screen are always there for a reason with Formula E, and sometimes when I'm watching F1 races, I can feel like the graphics being presented to me are designed to dazzle and impress me rather than give me what I need to know. Estimated chance of overtaking in the next 25 laps, and tyre quality and tyre degradation graphs. These are things that maybe would be interesting to somebody in the pits who was following along from hospitality, and I understand the great willingness to put us in the thick of the action, but it's almost the wrong information at the wrong time when it comes on, isn't it?
There's an argument that some amount of information can be too much information, and with F1, obviously, what they're angling for is to give as much information to the viewer as possible. I personally don't mind it. I think that that's Formula One's direction, and it's a valid one to go down. And there's a lot of fans that are taking to it quite well. But it does add to that dynamic of Formula One coverage. Is just out there to make your heart race as much as possible, and to over amplify the racing and to always make it feel like a huge adrenaline rush. And for some people, that's just not what they're after. They want their coverage to be, to supplement the racing rather than almost become the main meal. And I'd say that while I personally enjoy it, I can definitely understand why other people would get a bit tired of it.
There's almost this very traditionalist, quite fundamentalist wish from Formula One to show motorsport for people who like, getting dirty with oil and enjoy racing and don't enjoy politics and drama. And I know that Channel 4 in the UK have fought against this a little bit by basically having more interviews with Lando Norris, which is always fun, and by trying to get into the drivers' personalities a bit more, and they did it with Lewis Hamilton as well. But I don't think Formula E has ever shied away from the fact that motorsport is at its heart also a soap opera and a drama, has it?
Yeah, it's more emphasis is being put on the drama and emotion behind Formula One, say with Drive to Survive, which is back on the 28th of February on Netflix. I've basically just done a plug without meaning to, but
No
yeah,
problem.
it's a brilliant example of how drama and emotion in the sport is being portrayed a lot more, which is perfectly valid as far as I'm concerned. It's a new insight into Formula One, and it adds a different dynamic to what we're used to, which is obviously heavy focus on the racing and mechanical bits and how teams operate. Yeah, I think both can coexist, and both are sorely needed in Formula One. It's just, I think, balancing it out, and that's a lot down to the coverage of when you're watching and how things are handled. Like with Drive to Survive, how it's filmed is very important. What drivers it shows and when, what what the general theme of each episode is. And then with F1 commentary, it's, are you going to make like Are you going to make it a start fest as much as possible? Are you going to get people's hearts racing as much as possible? Or are you just going to more easily supplement the racing on hand with maybe less information, or maybe the same amount of information presented in a different way? It's not so much like what you're portraying as how much you're portraying it, and how each different aspect of the sport is balanced out.
Drive to Survive has had some interesting effects on motorsport in general, I would say. Luke Smith, the F1 journalist, wrote a really good article about this online recently. How Drive to Survive, the Netflix documentary about Formula One, brought to the fore, or at least maybe brought to his attention specifically, fans who call themselves Stans, i.e. Named after Eminem's character Stan from the song. People who will defend pretty much as a hill to die on their particular driver. And it's been so interesting recently following Twitter.
I absolutely see space for both. I think that there's plenty of space for fundamentalists to be able to watch the sport and enjoy the mechanics, the racing, and just leave it at that. And also for people to enjoy, like, the drama and character of drivers above all else, maybe not be so clued up on the history. I don't even particularly think that you need to, because ultimately, above all else, Formula One is an entertainment package. For the teams and the drivers, it might be, like, very, very important to know this history and this information, and it's do or die. But for people that are watching it, you can have casual watchers of racing as long as, you know what's going on in a season. You've had a look at the driver standings. Like, that sometimes can be all people need to enjoy Formula One, and sometimes it can just build up from there. They have some seasons where they just concentrate on the current season at hand and who's in that. And then years down the line, they might branch out. And that's how it started for me when I was racing in 2009. I didn't know much about the history, and I didn't really learn that until about 3 or 4 years later. Until then, it was just focusing on the current seasons, the drivers that were there, and that kind of thing. But I feel like a lot of the pushbacks instead come from the fundamentalists, which I don't particularly enjoy. I don't think that the new wave of fans are doing much wrong. From what I've seen, they generally keep to themselves, and I don't like this idea that it's necessary to gatekeep a new, different type of fan who's, like, adding a different element to the sport and its fan base, and the surrounding, you could say Drive to Survive, like, its popularity and the reason it's been brought back for another season with so much fanfare is because of these new type of fans taking to it so much. And I'd hate for that to be robbed away, and like, for that kind of element of Formula One to be shut down. And I feel like, the fundamentalists need to just let people live.
I would never say someone can't enjoy motorsport without, or can't enjoy Formula E, for example, without knowing what happened in season 1, or having followed the whole Buemi Degrassi saga right from the start, or having watched him, Buemi losing his stuff in Montreal season 3. It was funny, but if you didn't see it, you can catch up on it on YouTube. It's no problem. And I think Formula E, mercifully, is free from the kind of gatekeepers that we see elsewhere, or largely free anyway, because it's got quite a short history, and also the kinds of fans who come to electric motorsports, I think, are more the sorts of people who
they're progressives is how I'd describe it.
Yeah, there is a progressive wing, I think, to Formula E, which is very evident in the discussion after the race. And for V12,
on street circuits in places around the world that you wouldn't particularly expect top level racing to go to. And then you also get, obviously, electric powertrains that don't make noise, and the fundamental basics of Formula E are ones that, are at odds with these kinds of people who are racing fundamentalists and seem to be the gatekeepers. And yeah, that's why I feel like it's a much more easygoing and welcoming space for more progressive and new fans, because we've seen a lot of like fan engagement from the new wave of racing fans that we have now. The stands, like as they're commonly known, like they're crossing over into Formula E and finding that, hey, this is a very welcoming place, and the discourse has been absolutely fine. If anything, in Formula E, it's incredibly healthy, and it's a joy to see, because Formula E has become a very, very welcoming, open, intelligent space where there's a lot of content creation going on, and it's thriving. And I mean, we've all been in situations where we've gotten into something, or you like learned about, I don't know, maybe seeing a film or a TV show because we like a certain like character within it or actor for whatever reasons. And I think anyway, getting into the sport, like as long as it's not obviously actually detracting from someone else's experience, or like in a way that's not like just fragility, like it is with what I've seen from Formula One fundamentalists. Other than that, I mean, it's enjoy the sport how you want to and go at your own pace, and whatever way you have of engaging with the sport is valid, because at the end of the day, you're part of the same fan base as everyone else is. You're contributing towards that space, and there's no divine right for anyone to be able to say, no, you don't belong.
What kind of a circuit do you think the O'Higgins Park circuit is? Obviously, they made some changes to it. Do you feel that the changes helped? And do you feel that the circuit as a whole is one of the better Formula E circuits? Or do you feel it's lagging behind in certain respects? I would say, personally, I'm not particularly keen on the change of surface. The fact that it goes from concrete to smoothly paved road so soon. It makes it feel to me a bit like one of those F1 circuits in the US in the 80s, a bit cobbled together. But I understand also that Formula E's whole ethos is around city street circuits, and we need to put up with that occasionally. The hairpins certainly added to the action, but one criticism some people had was it made it seem a bit fairground, a bit bumper cars. Now, obviously that added to the spectacle in some cases, but would you say that maybe there were a few too many really tight hairpins on the circuit this time?
I think Santiago stakes a good claim as being potentially Formula E's best circuit right now. That's obviously a tough one and potentially controversial, because I know places like Berlin are still on the calendar, but the changes this year, I don't have too much of a strong opinion on them, really. Obviously, the track surface has changed a little bit, and there's been tweaks to the layout, but I found it incredibly enjoyable, and I thought like some of the hairpins were incredibly interesting. Obviously, we had flashpoints of action, like when Da Costa went for the almost like F1 race lobby overtake on Günther, like punt to pass.
You said it was a Forza Motorsport 2 Yeetathon.
Yeah, it was a game that I used to play, and in the online lobbies, it was just generally accepted that if you were leading the race, eventually someone was just going to yeet into the back of you and send you flying. So I suspect that's what Maxi felt like at the time when Da Costa went for that overtake. It was just, you just move out of the way and I'll just take this lead. And I have to say, I'm glad that Maxi took the lead back, because that was that overtake brought back memories of when I was shafted out of wins when I was playing Forza. It felt like a long overdue win. A bit of revenge.
But in terms of that Antonio Felix da Costa overtaking attempt, I think it was a butterfly effect, wasn't it, in a way? Because if you go back a few laps, he wouldn't have had to have made that desperate overtaking attempt on very little usable energy. if he hadn't have been stuck behind his own teammate for much longer than he needed. Jean-Eric Vergne had, from the early stages of the race, a rubbing left front wheel arch that was cutting into his tyre, or potentially cutting into his tyre, and he found this so annoying and detrimental to his race that he decided to try and drive it off by going into the wall at part of the track, it seemed. The thing is, while he was doing this and while he was faffing around with his wheel arch, his teammate Antonio Felix da Costa was behind him, and well, maybe you can describe what he did next.
Verne kept him behind for, I believe it was around 2 laps, maybe a bit less, while the wheel arch was jamming against the wheel. Plumes of smoke were coming from that wheel, and to be honest, Jean found himself very lucky that tyre didn't blow, because the wear that it was putting on that tyre was immense. You could see the plumes of smoke were big. And if I was Antonio, I'd be feeling incredibly aggrieved, very miffed, and I'd be using stern language after the race when I was with the team, because what Jean should have been doing is, in the interest of safety more than anything else, he should have been slowing down and moving out of the way instead of trying to block his teammate. And if I was calling the shots at Techeetah, I would have also been immensely annoyed at the fact that it wasn't so much Jean was trying to outlast the damage and try and get it off the wheel arch. It's don't hold up your teammate while you're doing that, because you could argue that's what cost the race.
Well, yeah, because while there isn't that much dirty air and turbulence like in F1, what they do have in Formula E is when you're following behind another car, it heats up your car and therefore your battery massively. And in a place like Santiago, where it's in the late 30s in terms of degrees Celsius, your battery is going to be overheating most of the race. So to be stuck behind your teammate for longer than you need to be is going to cost you later in the race when you need the extra power and when you need the extra battery percentage, isn't it?
Yeah. In a place like Santiago, you feel it more than other circuits. Ultimately, it wasn't a shining moment in Jean's Formula E career, but it's something that he'll learn from. It's something that Antonio will learn from, arguably losing a race under those circumstances, although he also could be argued to have not deserved it after his overtake attempt on Maxi and obviously how that was done. But it was a trying period for Techeetah, and they'll probably feel not too aggrieved that they got a second place out of it, a place on the podium, but it has to be said that Jean's title defence, like it was in Season 5, is starting very slowly, but I guess he'll be at least comfortable in the knowledge that he's already made a comeback once before, finding a rich vein of form near the end of the season, which took him to a second title in a row. He'll need that again if he wants to win a historic third.
Well, and it's very difficult to draw a pattern from a sample size of one season, but it does seem like the Gen 2 era is about the momentum you pick up in the season, not the momentum you carry in from testing, doesn't it? Just judging by the fact that Jev made a comeback having not won in 6 races last season.
Yeah, the Gen 2 cars are a different beast from the Gen 1 cars. They're wider, more powerful, but they seem, I won't say easier to race, but once you get them into the right racing conditions, they seem a lot more comfortable for the drivers. And when you get used to your machinery as the season goes on, it feels like the drivers can get more confidence out of it than they could in the Gen 1 cars. And I think that's what helped John along the way when he won his second title in Season 5.
I did want to pick up on one thing you said, which is that Jean-Eric Vergne would learn from this incident. He's a very experienced driver, and while I don't think anyone here is arguing, and I wouldn't want this to go away as people's thoughts. Neither of us dislike Jev as a person or a driver. I like him very much. I think he's gone through a lot in his career to get where he is. And Conrad, you've written a very glowing article about him being Formula E's GOAT, which was in 2 parts last season. So to set the scene, we both like Jev, but sometimes he picks very uncomfortable hills on which to die in terms of, metaphorically speaking, in terms of things that he doesn't need to do, and things where maybe it would benefit his team and his teammate if he didn't do. I'm talking about he holds up his teammate seemingly, and again, who knows what's running through a racing driver's mind at 180 miles an hour, but seemingly to kind of set out his stall that he's not going to give any ground. I don't know. What did you think?
I thought that it was just more Jean wants the highest result as possible. I could also say putting down an early marker because obviously Antonio's a new teammate and he comes with a storied background of his own in Formula E. So maybe it was an attempted power play, but I think it's just like Jean's competitive edge got the best of him, and he probably had an optimistic mindset about getting that damage off as quickly as possible, and he let it cloud his judgment. He should have moved over. There's no excuses for it. He should have moved over. It's more safety grounds than anything else, because if you're holding up your teammate who's on a charge for the win at those kinds of speeds because he was much slower, that can easily cause a crash. And Techeetah must have been incredibly worried during that period. But when I say Jev will learn from it, I think, like, even though he's a very experienced driver right now and he's probably been through every situation that there is to go through as a driver, there's some lessons along the way that you forget. And I feel like Jev forgot the magic rule of don't hinder your team, don't hinder your teammate, which will probably be fresh in his mind now after he's been talked to.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And certainly it's still true DS Techeetah have possibly, arguably, the strongest driver pairing in terms of two drivers who've been there, seen it and done it and won races and are both able to step up to the plate. And would you agree that's going to be a fascinating battle between the DS Techeetah drivers as we go through the season in terms of who's going to get on top and in terms of really what happens between them when they're racing against each other?
It's going to be incredibly interesting, I think. They're such a strong partnership, and it's like a team dynamic where there's two number ones, because I know Jev's coming off the back of 2 titles, but Antonio is that good that it's still hard to tell whether one's going to finish above the other in the standings. Antonio's capable of winning a Formula E title. It's very interesting and one that I can't wait to keep an eye on.
Our favourite person, by the way, Red Bull Junior Programme leader, Dr. Helmut Marko, was quoted in Autosport yesterday saying that the door at Red Bull is closed to any former drivers, specifically mentioning Jean-Eric Verne, but presumably also indirectly mentioning Antonio Felix da Costa. Now, I get an impression both of those drivers are not crying into their beer over that fact. Would you agree?
They're not going to be losing sleep over it. Jev's turned down Toro Rosso before. He turned them down. I think it was when they were looking to replace Brendan Hartley midway through 2018, or it might have been when he first got the drive. There was talk about Jev returning, and I believe an offer was made and he rejected it. So I feel like it almost feels like Helmut's come out and said this now in a way like, oh, well, if you do change your mind again, then you're not going to get the opportunity again. It kind of sounded bitter more than anything else.
Well, yes, and there are many reasons to not listen to Dr. Helmut Marko, but well, who else would motorsport magazines go to for clickbait at the end of the day? So moving down the order, then, Stoffel Vandoorne is top of the standings, followed by Alexander Sims and Sam Bird, who had a difficult race, shall we say, in Santiago. Do you think Sam is looking seriously at a title charge? And do you think with those 2 points from race three that he can now look with eyes forward, as his engineer says, and possibly shape this into a proper title tilt this time?
Sambird's always there. There's not been a championship where he hasn't been in and around the title fight. So I don't see season six being any different. He's only getting stronger and stronger as a driver. And there's going to come races where the luck falls his way or circumstances along with him performing. Yeah, I think he can contend for the title again. It's another story as to whether he'll finally win it. But I wouldn't rule it out. I wouldn't rule it out for Robin Friends either because it's easily forgotten about, but Friends finished ahead of Bird in the season five standings. So I'd expect Robin to be up there as well. I'd expect both Virgin drivers to be contending for a title.
So something of a bump back to earth for Mitch Evans and Jaguar. Mitch was streaking out ahead at the start. Presumably on the orders of his team, he used all his attack modes in the first half of the race. And a lot of people, including Jack Nicholls, said that that was sensible because he wouldn't be able to use them and get meaningful advantage from them later because the battery temperature would keep going up. So it was best to get the extra speed and pull out a lead at the start. Of course, he was then hindered by that full course yellow, which bunched the pack up again, and he was then hindered by the car's lack of speed in the second half of the race, partly because of running out of attack modes, but partly because of looking after his energy. He said afterwards he was unhappy with the pit lane calls, and he felt that things could have gone his way with a slightly better strategy. Would you agree, though?
I mean, anyone could have a better strategy and improve. So, it's a hard one to call.
I mean, would you say that there are teams that get the calls right most of the time, and then there are teams that could improve? Jaguar have won a race with Mitch, but they haven't exactly got the same kind of hardened experience of being up front every race like some teams have.
I also don't think they particularly have the car. I don't think Jaguar have ever had a car that is all that capable of winning many races or a championship. I think Mitch has overperformed at times. If anything, I look to Jaguar as one of those teams that are quite opportunistic with when they're able to take wins and podiums, and sometimes they don't get the strategy right, sometimes they do. I don't think there's much of a difference between them and other teams.
Big improvement for James Collado in this race meeting. He was quicker than Mitch in one of the practice sessions in the morning, although finished off the race with 4 points and is now 14th in the championship on 10 points. But I think he can be very pleased with 2 point scoring finishes in his first three races, and coming in where he did he was announced fairly late, so he had to get all his simulator and testing experience in within a few weeks before the start of the season. How do you rate him, both as a driver and in terms of how he's adapting to the sport?
I think he's doing a fairly impressive job. He's obviously secured some points along the way, and he's been an adequate replacement for Alex, and I'm fairly impressed with what I've seen from James. There's obviously it's not too much to get excited about because we're not talking about an explosive debut, but I don't think he's had the conditions in which to be able to do that. I think it's just taking things steady for now, learning the series, getting the feet under the table, and so far, I mean, there's not been any disastrous flashpoints, and points are on the board. So, yeah, I think there's a lot to be proud of for James, and there's ample opportunity for him to start rising up the table even more.
And I'm definitely not concerned trolling when I say this. I got the chance to talk to him at a Jaguar roundtable, and he was a really nice bloke. But I think it's different for drivers now when they're coming in because they get such a weight of opinion on their appointment, on how they're doing. And I think Alex Lynn was such a popular guy amongst the media, amongst the fans, that any driver coming in to replace him under any circumstances would have to prove a lot more than anyone else, I think, wouldn't they?
Yeah. When it came to Alex, it was quite a tough decision to make, to decide to drop him because he did such a brilliant job when he was taking over from Nelson Piquet Jr. to fill the Jaguar seat. But putting that aside, and obviously, like, away from the context of who he was replacing and why, the fact that James Collado came in was a good move, and his performances so far have been perfectly fine. Nothing to suggest that Jaguar will be having cold sweats over the decision.
Definitely. Who could we say had a quietly decent race? Nick De Vries certainly, even in spite of his time penalty, picked up some more useful points, and is now 11th in the championship with 18 points. But I think we'll see him rising up the standings pretty quickly. Would you say Nick De Vries and Mercedes are something of a dream combination, given that they both seem pretty much the smoothest and most consistent driver and team on the grid?
Yeah, I think they're a brilliant partnership for certain. Because I mean, obviously the stats don't lie, and they're both very far up the table, if not heading it.
Who would you say had a particularly good race and a particularly bad race from Santiago?
One that has been slept on for certain is, I reckon, I won't say Pascal Wehrlein because he got plenty of plaudits for his performance too. Van Dorn's, because most of the talk has been about Stoffel leading the championship, but I think it's kind of been forgotten as to why he's leading the championship in the first place, and it's because him finishing sixth feels fairly muted, and I think that says it all that you could reasonably expect Stoffel to be on the podium at every race, but it's those kinds of races that if he does end up winning the championship from here, it'll be races like Santiago where he finishes sixth and he's quite muted because we expect so much of him. I think that was a quietly impressive performance. That will probably be one of his worst performances of the season. I think a lot of his performances and results will be better than that. So to have that as in like the lower regions of how his season might go is very ominous for the others. One
And
driver that I think had a really tough time of it was Andre Lotterer. To be honest, Porsche in general, because Neil Jarni had a torrid time of things as it was in that race. And after the highs of Algeria, where Porsche got a podium in the first race with Andre, it was really tough. It was a trying weekend, and being kicked back down to Earth's dirt.
yeah, now Porsche came in pre-season telling everyone who would listen that they weren't expecting very much from this season. It was going to be transitional, that they hadn't had a chance to race in Formula E and they would see how it goes. They even, certainly in the half-hour documentary which Formula E posted on its YouTube channel, which is fantastic and everyone should see, they were saying the same thing there, right up until Andre Lotterer got that podium in Algeria. And it seemed from there like people were surprised into believing that Porsche, like they were sandbagging, they obviously knew all along they were going to be competitive. And did this result in Santiago and their struggles prove that they were correct in their assumptions?
Yeah, I think the performance in Santiago, although it was that Porsche can score points, and they've got drivers that can score the points. So I don't think Santiago is particularly representative of how their season's going to go either. Unless they develop a habit of screwing up, which I don't suspect they will. They've got fairly competent team members there. across the board. But yeah, I don't think we're going to see many highs like we did in Adiria. I thought that set a false amount of hope, not necessarily within the team because they'll have known that. Obviously, it was a fairly fortuitous result. It was definitely earned, but they won't always get those circumstances to be able to put in such a solid performance. But I think the balance is in the middle of that. Not really troubling the podium spots, but also not having like races where neither of the drivers score. I think they can be a solid mid-table outfit and progress from there. Kind of like what HWA was, except maybe not the pole positions and as many podiums.
Yeah, actually, HWA is a good analogy in that they had Stoffel van Dorn performing very, very well, surprisingly early on, and Gary Paffett struggling a bit with the equipment initially, and Neil Jarney seems to have taken a bit more time to adapt than certain other drivers to the Gen 2 Formula E chassis. Now, he did have those 2 races in Hong Kong with Dragon in season 3, I think it was, season 4 rather, but then after that, that was his Formula E experience. So would you say he's suffering because of that? And can we expect an improvement or not?
Yeah, I think that the lack of race time beforehand, before this season, will definitely be a factor. But eventually, the experience is going to remove the race rustiness. And yeah, I think that Neil will adapt to Formula E. He's got the talent for it. He might not be, like on the level of Andre at any point, but there's nothing to suggest that he can't, like make some significant inroads into that gap. Because yeah, in Formula E, we've had a lot of surprise packages where people have hooked it together, and there's other people that haven't performed quite as well. It's a complete lottery.
Porsche will show loyalty with Jarny just because big companies, and particularly big companies that work in Porsche's kind of way, like people who have proven themselves over a number of years. I think Jarny is an all-round racing driver. He's driven pretty much everything. He's driven F1, A1 GP, WEC, and Formula 2, GP2. So I think they know he's a guy that they can trust with his feedback, and I think he's a guy who will always come into the pits and be able to tell them exactly what he feels on the car, what needs to be improved. So I think even if he's not getting on the podium himself, because Porsche's got a long way to go before they're getting there regularly, I think he's going to be giving useful feedback which Andre can use and which he can use as well, isn't he?
Yeah, I think that Porsche have a fairly strong driver lineup, and it's the least of their worries right now. It's basically just bedding into Formula E, getting used to how everything functions, and becoming a solid, smooth racing outfit like what HWA's task was to do. The first season's not necessarily about, getting particularly inventive with driver lineups, even though obviously they did change Paffett for De Vries for the second season. But yeah, it's just getting the feet under the rug. That's really what most new teams try to do in Formula E. Like walk before you can run.
Looking forward very briefly before we finish to the next set of races.
I'm just looking forward to Mexico entirely. It's a wonderful circuit. Again, another one that you could argue is the best on the calendar, and we've had multiple races there. Each one's been exciting. We had Degrassi's incredible drive to victory in season 3, and then the season 5 race is, I would probably stake a claim to being Formula E's best race of all time. That
Actually, I've just checked. It's February the 15th, so it's the day afterwards. So, anyone in relationships has no fear. You can still take people out on Valentine's Day and not miss the Formula E. Mexico, seriously, yes, it was one of the best races last season. And that windy stadium section where you have the fans all around and where you have that tremendous atmosphere, and also those hairpin corners with the wide runoff area, they they do tend to lead to quite good close racing, don't they?
Mexico is just a brilliant place for racing. It also helps that it's the a circuit on the calendar that, although it is arranged like a street circuit, it is actually a permanent racetrack, which means it's obviously wider and more forgiving when it comes to runoff. I think that drivers have more confidence there in a place like Mexico, and they're able to push the cars to the limits more, like with less fear of obviously wrecking it. In certain places that will still happen, but in others they can be a bit more rough about it.
And the race after that, which we'll cover in more depth in the next podcast, Marrakesh. Now, this is something of an unexpected bonus because the race was initially cancelled due to, well, too many other races bidding for space on the calendar, but we've got it back. Now, this is a place that, according to some journalists, that the teams and the media don't necessarily enjoy, but according to some fans who've been there, it's the best thing ever. So, what do you think it is about the circuit and about the atmosphere of Morocco in general that brings something different to Formula E?
I think the heat and the climate, and it's a beautiful place in Morocco, and it's something quite different. It's quite a different experience to other races we get on the calendar. It's a nice little refreshment to be able to go there, and the track's good. The track's good for certain. And again, there's been some brilliant races there last season. For instance, we had the incident between Da Costa and Sims.
Over Christmas, something very exciting happened in motorsport. An actor within motorsport who is often overlooked, unfairly overlooked. He has finally been given his day in the spotlight thanks to a young author named Josh Wilcock. I'm talking, of course, about Bruno Giacomelli and Josh's new book, The Autobiomell, which covers the life and times and career of potentially the best driver in the world who never won a Formula One race. Have you had a chance to look at this book? And what are your impressions on an F1 fan stepping up to the plate so well and producing what's really a labour of love?
I've read it. I've read it entirely, and I'm absolutely in love with the work. I know it's a glorified bit, but that's what makes it so special above anything else, is that what has been produced is genuinely a proper book with all the quality you'd expect of an author that's been doing this for 20, 30 years and has an eye for comedy, has an eye for drama, has an eye for really touching emotion, and can really make you care about what seemed to everyone else like a small footnote in history. And you feel the passion, and I can't recommend it highly enough. Autobiomell is absolutely worth a read, and I'm not just saying this because I know Josh well and he's my friend. I mean, if I didn't know him and I'd pick that up off a bookshelf, he's just brilliant. I mean, I'm trying to find the words, but an absolute must read.
The cover art has been drawn by an incredibly talented artist called Hayley Mulcahy, and the foreword is written by Hazel Southwell as well. So it's
the humour and wit is unrivaled in it. Absolutely spot on.
It told me many things about a driver that I had, I'll be honest, ignored before now, that I didn't know and that fascinated me. And there were certain bits that felt like they could have been on that border between truth and you wish it could have happened, such as the outline of Niki Lauda's stand-up comedy set in the driver's strike in 1981. But the book is so good that everything that's in there, you believe in it, and you believe in the guy that the book is about. And the thing I want to see next is Bruno Giacomelli come out of hiding and speak to Josh for a podcast. That would be tremendous.
Yeah, and that's the one thing that we're missing from this entire arc with Josh and Bruno is a meetup.
You can get the book. It's on a voluntary donation basis. You can download it for free if you want, or you can donate money if you want as well. Just search for it on Google. It's Autobiomell. And 45% of profits from the Autobiomell will be donated to the New South Wales Rural Fire Service. So he's not only written a great book, he's also a great bloke, is Josh. So go and take a look at that book anyway. Conrad, thank you so much for spending the time with me again, and let's do this again after the next Formula E race.